I believe in God our Father. I believe introduction or a section here on how we learn about conflict in the Bible. After hearing the stories this morning, I think we can appreciate that God's very aware of how conflict happens among us. And conflict isn't always a bad thing. We're talking more about very difficult conflict that is very hard to resolve. The simple conflicts often bring us a long way down the road toward understanding new ideas. So I'm really talking about the more difficult conflicts that we encounter. When our community gets broken and we have to figure out how do we want to repair or restore it. And so there are several Bible sections, Bible verses, sections, and stories that I'm going to take you through. And then I want you to be thinking about places that you draw a sense of how God wants us to be when these things come up and how we can take care of ourselves and the people around us when there's serious conflict going on. So one of the first sections I would turn to would be Acts 6. And in Acts 6, we learn about how there's the conflict over feeding the widows and the people who are poor, and the church has a hard time with it. And one of the problems is that one person can't do everything, and I'm sure that sounds familiar. And so they come in, and there's also the sense of there being a group that's being excluded because of their background or their origins. And so there are two pieces going on in this scripture in Acts 6. And what happens is that they have a meeting, and they state their case, and they decide that there should be 7 people appointed, and they're headed by Stephen, and the 7 people take over and do the feeding of the poor and the widows, and everyone thinks that's a great solution, and then they decide to send some of their members away and to do the preaching and the teaching, and they call it serving the table, is what they call giving the goods to the poor. But it's a wonderful resolution for the people involved. We don't know how much discussion there was, but they had a problem. They worked it out by coming together and trying to deal with what was broken. And so that's one story I want you to keep in mind. A second one would be in Acts 15, and this is the one we're probably more familiar with, but it's where the people who are being converted to Christianity who are not Jewish, there has to be a decision about whether or not they are going to live by the Jewish law. And specifically in these verses, it's will they be circumcised for the men. And there's a wonderful discussion in there as the people come together to talk about how do we manage this. And there are people, Pharisees actually there, who say, we have to go by the law. We have to go by the law as it is, and they need to come under Jewish law. And then there's a wonderful part in there that I think can really apply to current day Methodism and probably some other denominations, but it lets us know that God wanted everyone to be included, even the ones who were of other backgrounds, other races, whatever you want to call it. God wanted other beliefs, wanted them to be brought in. There was not to be a differentiation among them at all. And so that is, I think we can all take heart in that as we have many debates and we have our way forward coming up. I hope that this can be a guide to us, that God wants everybody to be included, and we don't set limits on who can come about. We love each other and maybe let God do the judging. So that's another place that it comes up. And the third section I'm going to actually let Dave talk to you about later, but I want to point it out because it was formative for me when I first learned about it, and that was Matthew 18 and how it's broken down in Matthew 18 about this is Jesus talking about what do we do when there's conflict among us. And Jesus says, and this almost never happens, as we well know, you go to the person who's offended you. So if I said something that offended Don, I hope Don would come to me first. But a lot of times we know that in many social situations, not just churches, people go to everyone else around them. It's kind of like they're building a team, but without even letting the other person know that this is a problem. And so the ultimate outcome of that usually is a lot of alienation, but certainly somebody gets blindsided along the way. And so what Jesus does in this section is, if that doesn't work, what do you do next? And if that doesn't work, what do you do next? And again, I'm going to let Don cover that, but I want to point that out because I think we often lose our way as far as following Jesus on that part too. And then I want to go into, and some of this is going to come out of a situation we had here at Concord about conflict, but there was a time where someone was being very hostile toward one of our pastors, and it went before different boards with this person pursuing it on and on and on, and even came to the point that there was a briefcase brought in that nobody knew what was going on. And so there was eventually a good intervention, I think, by the church leadership where they had to bring a lawyer in. And at one point, one of the spouses, the spouse came in for this person and said, "This person is not going to harm you." And to her credit, where I want to talk to you about is what kind of harm are we talking about, because I don't want us to be thinking that harm is just violence of physical acts. It can be violence of words. There can be a lot of harm done from that. And what happened in this case was the associate pastor said, "Let's talk about harm." And she went on to point out that a lot of what had gone on up to this point had been very harmful to the staff of the church. It had undermined their ability to feel like they could move forward and make great plans because they were constantly having to defend and do encounters with this particular complainant. And so I wanted to point out to you that harm comes in many sizes and forms, and you don't want to overstate it, but you don't want to understate it either. And in that way, I want to introduce a segment on the prophets, because I do think that there's a biblical justice in all this, where when these kinds of things happen and take over a church, there's some oppression of the church's mission, of the ministry, of the pastors, and of the congregants, sometimes depending on where the hostility is coming from. And we lose our way in ways that we never wanted to and didn't intend to. And how do we regain that? We'll be talking about that this afternoon. But I wanted to introduce this coming from the prophets, that, it's not just like a scale like we think of Western justice. This is more like Amos with rolling waters and a roiling river. We have to follow justice that way too. And that means that we will not be oppressed. We will be able to be vocal and say what we need to say, and that we will do our best not to harm people along the way. And there certainly are many ways that we can say what's on our mind without hurting other people in a deep, deep way. We might call them to account in a way, but that's different than real harm and calling names and that kind of thing. So, along those lines, I was going to read you a couple of quotes on biblical justice that I like a lot. And one of those is that Jesus was fiercely critical of the abuse of political and religious power, the marginalizing of the poor and weak, and reliance on lethal violence. Abuse, harm, and violence happen in words and not just in physical actions. Biblical justice is all about creating and sustaining healthy, constant, life-giving relationships between parties. Kindness and mercy are therefore essential to achieving justice. And ultimately, that's where we want to be. And so I think we are God's agents of reconciliation as best we can be. I know that there are times, and we certainly are going to talk about some of those, where we get stymied by trying to be reconciliatory too much, but I think we at least want to aim for that and do the best we can. And then if we can't be reconcilers, and some situations can't be reconciled, we at least want to be fair and just and open to the people who are in front of us and dealing with struggles along the way. And so one more thought, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me some of the stories of conflict that sustain you in the Bible, or maybe it's something from Psalms that sustains you, but ways that we know we can deal with conflict that are creative and productive and not harmful to other people and ourselves. Justice means doing all that is necessary to create and sustain healthy, constant, and life-giving relationships between persons. It is to be measured by the extent to which people honor their obligation to live in relationships, because we're really trying to repair and restore relationships that uphold the dignity and rights of the other. And I think we heard some wonderful examples this morning of that, as far as churches who had struggled and dealt with it well. But that being said, let me ask you, what sorts of things are there scriptures you've used for yourself personally, or have you used them in a larger setting that have sustained you, or do you have reflections on the ones that I have just cited here that you think work well or might not work in certain situations? I'm just kind of open. So,
I'd like to
yes.
start with one reflection from Acts 6. Here we go. That you mentioned that I think is worth unpacking a little bit more. So when those 7 individuals were chosen, Stephen and the others, they all had one thing in common. It was the Greek-speaking Jews murmuring against the Aramaic-speaking Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. But do you know what the one thing in common with that all those 7 men who were chosen had? Greek names, which simply means the apostles went to the whiners and complainers and said, we'd like your help in solving this problem. And so all 7 of those who were chosen were from the group that was whining and complaining, which is a brilliant strategy for leaders. Not when you're dealing with antagonists. This is a little bit different topic. But when you're dealing with people who are unhappy, get them involved in solving the problem.
Yeah.
And that's why it was so successful for the early church.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, but we'd also like your comments and reflections on passages that have been meaningful to you.
Thanks. Those are wonderful. Thank you for directing us to those passages of Scripture. I would also just like to encourage, in addition to those, the Proverbs have been tremendously meaningful in my life. I think about Proverbs 16:28, about whispering, not dividing friends. I also think about the proverb, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but where the proverb says, you don't have to answer a fool according to his folly, and then followed by answer a fool according to his folly, or else he'll think himself wise. So for me, if there's a conflict situation in the church or life in general, it's a question of my daily prayer, and sometimes hourly or minutely, Lord, give me the wisdom when to speak, or not to speak.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to throw those in the mix.
Thank you. Deb?
Micah 6:8.
Yes.
That's it. No.
Micah 6:8, Deborah said that we all know to love kindness, do mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Yeah.
I thought a lot when I was going through my experience about Matthew 5:44, which says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you."
Yeah.
Yeah, it may not change our enemies, but it will change us, in my experience.
Appreciate the two of you have pointed out about the importance of prayer too, because that ability to sit back and reflect with God on what's going on can be immensely helpful. Yeah.
I just looked up Proverbs 15 from the Message, and it's a gentle response diffuses anger, but a sharp tongue kindles temper fire. God doesn't miss a thing. He's alert to good and evil alike. Kind words heal and help. Cutting words wound and maim.
Thank you. So that's Proverbs 15. Yeah. Thank you.
Psalm 34:4, I sought the Lord, He answered me, and He took away my fear. For somebody like me who doesn't like conflict, taking time to pray and ask the Lord for the courage to take away that fear so I can step into where God is leading us and be that leader, and going with my fear, because that's not leaving, but going with it to go in there. So that's my verse.
To go in, be willing to do that. Thank you. That's good.
That's important. The opposite of faith is not doubt, in my opinion. Doubt is just the flip side of faith. But the opposite of faith is fear. And so asking God to give us faith to move forward is a great strategy.
When I feel like I'm being trying to be triangled into something, I think of Jesus and his experience when the woman was taken in adultery, and the situation he had there with them about to stone her, and he was a non-anxious presence for sure. And I think he fought being triangled there, and some good came out of it. So, and I don't right now I'm fighting to stay awake after lunch, so I can't remember. I can't remember exactly where the passage is on that. So somewhere, I think it's somewhere in the New Testament.
Yes, thank you.
John.
I know there's one in Matthew, I believe, about being wise as a serpent, and I've seen that one misused some, but I think it's also a good one to be able to think things through well.
In 1 Timothy, Paul is writing his friend, and he tells about a situation in his greeting that there are two individuals that he's had conflicts with and that he's kind of lost his patience with, and he's stepped away from them. And I think that's important for us to note that we can't solve all the world's problems, and sometimes we need to just step away. And so that's 1 Timothy 1, 16, 17, somewhere in that area where he does that. He just steps away. And so I think that's important for us to remember, because we have limitations on our patience, our love, our compassion, whatever it may be. So important for us to remember.
That's excellent, and to step back and step away, and then also sometimes just to, sometimes we just can't solve it at all, but sometimes at least gives us a chance to recollect and all. Because if you're coming out of anger and you're all turned up, you're not going to have a real good solution to something more than likely anyway, because the thinking brain isn't working so well. So you're going to be running on solid emotion, and that's not usually helpful. Yeah.
What were the passages from Acts that you named?
Acts 6 and Acts 15.
There are two passages I kind of use together to help me have patience, and one is John 15:12.
Okay.
Love as I have first loved you. And the second is Romans 5:6-8. I died for you while I was yet a sinner, while you were yet a sinner. And that gives me patience to deal with people who are in my face.
Yeah. Thank you.
there's a
Yeah.
difference between enabling and having patience. I understand that, but
Yes, and to the extent we're going to be able to have mercy, it's going to be able to see what the other person is going through, not just ourselves. And so, yeah, to be able to look at that and cultivate our own mercy is good.
In fact, while we were yet sinners and enemies of God, Christ died for us, thus demonstrating love for enemies that we're called to as well.
Yeah.
There's one passage in Proverbs, I think it's in 21 or 22, that I think is misused and misinterpreted sometimes, is the idea of praying for someone is like heaping hot coals upon their head, and God will reward you for that.
Oh, my.
I think that's misused a lot of times. People see it as, oh, now I can take revenge.
Yes, yes, and that's not what we're about. Thank you. And I was curious about that. I started to ask and didn't, but now that we've had that introduced, are there ones that you feel like sometimes have been too ambiguous to be helpful, or you've had them used in ways you would question, but we can take them a different way? Yeah. So if any of you have comments like that, that's helpful, because I think it's good to have a heads up that some of these can be so restorative to us as far as trying to see our way through something, but sometimes they can be used almost as weapons, and we want to be aware of that too.
I just remember from a pastor we had before, not a pastor, but a pastor's wife. He was gone one day, and he said, and she got up on the pulpit and she spoke about your tongue, and she said, it don't matter how many times you apologize to somebody. After you've once said something, they're still going to remember that from then on. And she said, so stop and think like you're talking about. Stop and regroup before you say what you got on your mind, because you're going to usually say something you don't want to.
Yeah, thank you. That's very good. Walter's, yeah.
Or as my wife sometimes says, it's not what you said, David, it's how you said it.
Absolutely.
Thinking about the hot coals, again, that may not always be punitive when you're praying and loving someone, that the Lord's going to get them. One thing to realize that in that particular historical time, the master of the house would send the servant, who usually did not have shoes to keep him from running away, down to the dump to pick up hot coals and they would put the hot coals on a pan and carry them back, wrap them, and put them at the master's feet. So the master was not thinking, the master was not trying to be good to the servant who had no feet to go out in the cold in the middle of the night and get these ambers to bring back for his personal warmth and comfort. But his indifference toward the servant ended up warming his body, because on his way back, told in those hot coals, he had an opportunity to be warm. So sometimes our love toward a person who's being negative toward us has a positive effect. It's not the effect that we come off being so super spiritual that the Lord is going to join in the battle, align himself with us and go get them. Amen?
Amen.
I'm going to be so good to you, the Lord strike you, or something like that. But a lot of times our love toward an individual who has a negative or dark spirit may warm their heart. Just something to think about.
Thank you. The counter story comes out. Yeah.
Moses gives some advice. Moses, his father-in-law, gives some advice to Moses in his leadership. He says, Moses' father-in-law replied, "What are you doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to Him. Teach them His decree and instructions, and show them the way that they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judge for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves, that will make your load lighter, because they will share with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all the people will go home satisfied." You know, Moses was having a difficult time in leadership. So I think if you're having a difficult time with your leaders, you know, select your team of people for support. And I think that's pretty much what his father-in-law was instructing to Moses, to seek out the wise people who are godly, that will support you in your difficult time in order to combat those problems. So
Thank you. And that was one of the things I think that was here. Construct your relational network, I think, is how we rephrased it. But thank you. That's an excellent scripture for that.
I wrote an article for our congregational consulting blog titled, "Why Lone Rangers Always Fail." And it's precisely that point. If you try to do this by yourself, you will not succeed. And you need a team of people to support you in doing it. Well said. Any others?
Any others? Well, if you do, raise your hand real fast, but otherwise, thank you so much. I think this has been so helpful. I think I got a lot of great ideas from it, and I hope others did too. Because I think when you're in these situations, you just need the backup. You need to know spiritually and mainly spiritually and psychologically what you need to do to get yourself through and to help others get through. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. And I want to unpack Acts 15 a little bit more, because there's one other piece I want to get to on that. So you might remember that the party of the Pharisees were the group that wanted circumcision to be required for Gentile men as well as the Jewish men, who would have been circumcised at 8 days. But they actually ended up losing on that point. The Jerusalem Council decided not to require circumcision. But then they wrote a letter requiring 4 things. And do any of you remember what those 4 things were? Some of them seem very obscure. Pardon? Don't eat blood. That was one. What else? somebody has probably preached on this. Don't eat the meat of strangled animals. Do not commit sexual immorality, and don't eat food offered to idols. Now, the first two of those would have made perfect sense to Jewish and Gentile believers because Jews were particularly horrified by idolatry, so they wouldn't have wanted to eat meat had been offered idols, and they were also horrified by sexual immorality, which was rampant among Gentiles at that time, both Roman and Greek. But the other two, I was always puzzled by when I would read, what is it about not eating blood and not eating meat from strangled animals? Until I was talking with a Jewish friend one day, and he said, oh, they were telling them to respect kosher food requirements. Why would you tell Gentile believers to respect kosher food requirements? That animals should be cut at the throat and bled out, basically. Because at that time, there were congregations of mixed Jewish and Gentile believers all over the Near East. And what they were basically saying, the Jerusalem Council, they were basically saying to the Gentile believers, please respect your Jewish brothers and sisters. It may be okay for you to eat food like this, but it's not okay for them. So we're going to give on the big issue. The big issue was circumcision, but we're not going to give on the even bigger issue, which is respect. Please respect your Jewish brothers and sisters by upholding these 4 requirements. So think about that. It was, I think it was Spirit inspired. Those guidelines that to us sound so strange today made perfect sense to my Jewish friend because they're kosher requirements. Please respect them even if you're a Gentile. Okay, let's switch gears and Mike. I use this. There were some congregations where it would have been a majority Gentile believers and some congregations where it would have been a majority Jewish believers, but they were mixed all over the Near East at that time. And I think what the Jerusalem Council was saying is we need to respect each other, majority or minority. We need to respect the deepest sensibilities of each other.
So you've been advocating for mutual respect.
Thank you. Well said. What he said, yes. That was great.
I don't think that's all,
though. Okay, am I coming through yet? No.
Turn it off.
Now I'm coming through. I will be. Okay. So if we get the technology right, I want to share a PowerPoint with you that summarizes what Ken Houck has to say, and I'm going to add a couple of my own observations along the way, but knowing that all of you have received this wonderful book, this is the second edition of his book that came out in 1988, and it has some great advice in it for dealing with true antagonists. But I just want to preface it by saying I think true antagonists are about 1% of a congregation, not 10%. So we tend to see antagonists when people are simply behaving badly, not necessarily true antagonists that, from his description and from my own experience, probably have a personality or a character disorder, and it's causing them to replicate this behavior in multiple settings. And when we hear the stories, we find out it's usually not just in one congregation, but it's been a pattern throughout their lives. So let's see if we can get this system working.
Here's what I found on the web, Crystal. Let's see if we can get the system working.
Well, that's interesting. Siri is working just fine, so let's try it again. Okay, technical assistant. I'm going to need your help. It's working. Thanks. Okay, I want to start by talking about the 5 levels of conflict that I mentioned earlier, because We are most likely to see this kind of behavior at levels 4 and 5, but I want to briefly describe the first 3 to you, and then I'll say more about levels 4 and 5. This was developed by Speed Lease, the senior consultant with the Alban Institute, and he said that every conflict starts out as a problem to solve. It's between 2 individuals, and I'll pick on Don to illustrate this. Don and I may be working together, and an issue comes up that we need to talk about. Maybe it's an expense report, and I come to Don and I say, I really think I should be reimbursed for this expense. And Don said, well, I'm not sure I see it that way, but let's talk about it. That's a problem to solve. We're both focused on the problem. We don't have ill feelings towards each other, and 9 times out of 10, we work it out. Sometimes it escalates to level 2, which he calls a disagreement. And in a disagreement, it's starting to get a little more tense, but it's still focused on the issue. So I might say something like, in my previous employment, I was always reimbursed for this expense. I really think it's legitimate. And Don might respond, how might you respond? Just disagreeing.
Well, maybe that's the way it was in your previous work, but around here, that's not what we do.
Yeah. So we have a disagreement, but we should be able to work it out, because if we talk through it enough, hopefully we can find a solution. 9 times out of 10, that works. 10% of the time, it goes to level 3, which is a contest, or it's when we start to realize that there is a conflict. So the 2 individuals who are involved are still talking, but they're talking with a little more edge in their voice, and they're starting to become person-focused rather than problem-focused. So I might say something like, Don, you're being completely unreasonable. I mean, if I would go anywhere else with this expense, they would say, that's a legitimate expense, that should be reimbursed. I really think you're an unreasonable person. And Don might respond,
I have no idea what you're talking about. No, you don't need to take that tone with me.
Excellent.
We have our rules. We have clear protocols and procedures about this. You are not following them, and this is not going to be reimbursed.
Excellent. So the you language starts to come in at level 3, whereas before we were talking about the problem as something we both shared. Now we start to see the other person as the problem. That's level 3. Everybody in this room, I presume, has been in a level 3 conflict at some point in your life, because it happens to human beings. At level 4, there's a significant shift that takes place, because I start to give up on converting Don to my beliefs, and I start talking with others about Don. So I might sit down with a couple colleagues and say, I'm sure this has happened to you too. Working with Don is just impossible. He's probably the most unreasonable person that I've ever... Now, I'm making all of this up because I've actually found Don to be incredibly reasonable, but he might have the same conversation with a different group of people, and this is what level 4 conflict looks like. It's called fight-flight because some of the behaviors that we looked at here of divisive behaviors, coalition building, starts to happen, not necessarily because we're bad people, but because I'm so frustrated I wasn't able to convince Don that I was correct, so now I'm talking with other people to try to build a bit of a power base so that maybe I can win the argument. Now, my hunch is if you've been in congregational life for 5 years or more, you've seen this kind of behavior, because it happens in organizations all the time. I consult with a lot of organizations, not just congregations. That's level 4 behavior, where we start to see coalitions emerging and people disagreeing that may have started out as a relatively simple, innocent issue, like an expense report or a budget disagreement, but becomes something that is divisive for the congregation. How many of you would say at some point in some congregation you've seen level 4 behavior? Okay, just look around the room, so you'll see. Now, at level 4 is when these unhelpful behaviors start to become pretty endemic. So things like avoidance, some people don't want to get involved, destructive acts, violence, more common at level 5, negativity, power moves, anger, gossip, triangulation. By definition, I'm clearly here triangling people in. And by the way, a triangle is the strongest geometric form. So because my dyadic relationship with Dawn is so unstable, it's human nature to try to triangle, to find a therapist sometime to talk with, or to find others who maybe are not as appropriate to talk with. Blurred boundaries, talking about things out of turn, and sometimes even trying to form a coalition to divide and conquer. Passive-aggressive behavior, so I might be nice to Don's face, but talk negatively about him behind his back. It's passive-aggressive. And coalition building and bullying could also happen if I'm taking that person on directly. So these behaviors are actually fairly common for level 4 conflict as well as for antagonists. And this is why it's confusing, because decent human beings, probably not Don, but would not do this, but I might. Even decent human beings can do really unhelpful things with other people when we're at level 4 conflict, because we're so frustrated. And it's why it's hard to sort out. Is this antagonism? Is this an antagonistic bully? Or is this someone who just is not acting appropriately because of conflict intensity? So let me pause there and see if any of you have comments on how to sort that out, because it can be tough. While you're thinking about it, I'll just mention level 5 conflict. Level 5 is when people are actively trying to hurt each other. And it's when people are trying to drive the pastor out of the pulpit, and in one case I worked with, make sure he or she never preaches anywhere else. That's level 5 behavior. In international relations, it's Israel and Palestine, where people are simply hurting each other back and forth, and there's no evident resolution for that. We could think of examples in organizational life beyond congregations as well, but level 5 behavior is very destructive and very rare. I've worked with 50 congregations in my career, and I've seen 3 that made it to level 5. That's it. And it's because at level 4, what usually happens is people just leave, or one group leaves, or it de-escalates on its own and doesn't go to level 5. So my hunch is very few of you have seen or been in the middle of level 5 conflict, thank God. So, but your comments on how to distinguish between this and truly dysfunctional antagonistic behavior.
Well, it's not
It's on.
really my question. My question is, a lot of places, like workplaces, which I don't know if the church also may have this, but in a policy it will say they don't tolerate bullying. What is bullying when they say that in the policy?
So I can define antagonistic behavior using Houck's definition, which I will in a minute, which I think in essence is a description of bullying behavior. So if I can hold on to that for just a sec and get to that definition. Anybody want to tackle that question of how do we know when people are simply behaving badly because it's high intensity conflict and when people are truly antagonists? And I'm looking at you because you mentioned dealing with some specific cases of that.
Is it out of character for that person?
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking, is the antagonistic behavior somebody expressing out of character for them, or is this a temporary issue?
Right. I think that's spot on, by the way. Is there a pattern of this behavior in the past?
Different systems, different environments. Mm-hmm. Is it a pattern in multiple locations?
Right.
Are they known to be like that at work? So.
Excellent. So look for the pattern as opposed to an isolated behavior of, Dave must be really upset about this because he usually doesn't talk that way about others. Okay, so I want to go on a little bit further with this and look at appropriate strategies in each of these situations. Just have to enter a passcode every time. Okay. So, follow the steps of Matthew 18. For most conflict situations, it works really well. And I think you'll all be familiar with these steps. When there's a problem to solve, use dialogue. Jesus said, if you have aught against your brother or sister, go to that person and show them their fault just between the two of you. Or we might say today, when you're in conflict with another person, go to that person directly and try to work it out. And if it's level 1 conflict, if Don and I truly have a disagreement about something, we probably should be able to do it. Sometimes it needs to be a little more formal. Step 2, negotiation. If Don and I have chatted about it and we're still at loggerheads, I might say to him, I wonder if we could sit down over lunch and really talk this through, and I could better understand the history of the policy, and maybe you could better understand what I've experienced in other organizations in the past. Maybe we could reach some kind of compromise or at least joint understanding. To take the time to actually negotiate rather than just chat about it. When it's level 3, when it's a true conflict and I'm starting to believe that the other person is a bad person, that's when it's really helpful to bring in a third-party mediator. And Jesus talks about this clearly in Matthew 18. Jesus says, if he refuses to listen to you, then bring 1 or 2 others along. So are there 1 or 2 others that could help us to talk about the issue where we disagree? And often it doesn't have to be a formally trained mediator, but somebody we both trust. And I did this with a colleague several years ago where she and I had tried a number of times to work through something. We were just stuck. And I said to her, I'm wondering if there's a person that you and I both trust that we could invite into this conversation. And she had a name of someone. I felt very good about that person, and the 3 of us got together. Sorry, I'm going to decline this phone call. Okay. Next, fight flight. If it truly is level 4 and factions have started to emerge, Lee's recommends, in my own experience, you probably need to back up and put in place some kind of consultative process. It may mean bringing in the DS or the bishop or other person internal to your system. It may mean bringing in an outside consultant, but typically you need somebody to kind of slow things down, listen to both sides, and try to bring people together in a very carefully organized process. And at level 5, even though it's rare, this is where people refuse to give up and where you're most likely to see an antagonist in the middle continuing to stir things up. What Lee says, what Houck says, and what my own experience says is that you probably need the exercise of authority, probably from outside of the congregation. And this is where it's helpful. You're fortunate, actually, to have bishops still, you and the Episcopalians. I work a lot with Baptist churches and Mennonite churches and others that don't have that level of authority. And there are cases where I wish we had them. I wish we had an outside authority that we could call in, because that's what's needed in these highly escalated situations or when dealing with a true antagonist, which we'll talk more about. Okay, so the definition. The definition of an antagonist, and this fits for a bully as well, individuals who on the basis of non-substantive evidence, which means they are making up the evidence in their own minds, it's not substantiated, it's not proven, go out of their way to make insatiable demands. That's the next key phrase. Insatiable means there is nothing you can do to satisfy them. That if you meet one of their demands, there will always be a second. And if you meet that, there will always be a third. And in fact, it feeds them when you are meeting their demands. I'll say this out of personal experience. Usually attacking the person or performance of others. So they don't focus on the issue, they focus from the beginning on the person, attacking the individual. The attacks are selfish in nature, tearing down rather than building up, so this is not constructive criticism. And are frequently directed against those in the leadership capacity. So I'm not sure why it is, but the antagonists that I have dealt with, and I could count them on one hand, so this is not a lot of people in 30 years, but one of whom was a former student in my own program, will focus almost from the beginning on a person in a key leadership role. I was department chair, so he focused on me. If you're the pastor, he or she is likely to focus on you. If you're the bishop, it inevitably happens eventually. If you're a district superintendent, then I imagine you've encountered it as well. But those three things pretty much have to go together to define a true antagonist. And that is insatiable demands, never satisfied, attacking the person, and the person most often to be attacked is someone in leadership. Am I correct? Is how correct in this case? So there are antagonists, and I hate to use the noun, but I'm willing to use it in some cases, that are maybe 1% of those in our congregations. But if you're in a congregation of a couple thousand, there might be several. Okay.
How do you stitch that together with the concept of a bully?
Yeah, so they use bullying behavior. And let me run through this list from Hauk. Here's why antagonists are very different than average people in high-intensity conflict. They're unlikely to ever change, so they have repeated that pattern of behavior in other places. They're likely to exhibit, and these are clinical traits, so we have to be really careful, narcissism, aggression, rigidity, and authoritarianism, as well as paranoid and antisocial personality traits. These are diagnostic categories in the DSM-5, and I'm wondering, Susan, if you could say a word about POP diagnosis. Why is it difficult for us to decide if someone is these things?
A POP diagnosis is pretty, you rarely know enough about a person to do a POP diagnosis. So you're going out on a limb sometimes that is dangerous for you and kind of slanderous of the other person. So, doing your best to keep within the bounds of what you know about that person. You can describe them as being difficult to deal with, but I think to use the diagnostic category is very harmful, has great potential to be bad.
So in the case that I was dealing with, when I realized I was beyond my expertise, because all of my conflict transformation techniques, which had always worked really well for everyone else before, did not work with this individual. I could not de-escalate his behavior. I went to a PhD psychologist who was on our faculty, and I said, I need your help to understand what's going on. These are the behaviors that I'm observing. And based on his own interaction with this individual student, my psychologist friend said, yes, you are dealing with a narcissistic personality disorder, and all of the things that you are doing will not work. In fact, they'll only feed into the disorder. Antagonists typically display red flags. It's chapter 8 in your book. He has a whole list of 18 different red flags that antagonists will display. A lot of it is about self-focused behavior, calling attention to themselves and their own greatness. Grandiosity, I think, is another characteristic. This point we're going to come back to. A congregation's environment, which means its culture, can either attract or repel antagonists, i.e., they can make it a wonderful place for them to thrive, or they can make it a difficult place for them to exist. But I want to get your comment in the mic, if I could.
Would counseling help that person, help an antagonist?
Not traditional counseling, and Hauk says don't recommend counseling, but that's because you will really make someone angry if you imply that it's their issue, because they're absolutely convinced it's not. What's needed to help an antagonist? Yeah.
I don't have, not psychotherapy usually, because they don't think the problem is with them, and as Dave said, it's going to alienate them. What's needed to help them is, I think, to be very firm with them and let them know that you see their tricks or their way of being, and that you will not be able to have that in your congregation or tolerate it.
Yeah. That the behavior is unacceptable and needs to change. By the way, notice these last couple of points. Leaders must use their authority to respond to antagonism. So you have your authority as a pastor or a lay leader, which we have to use in order to say that is unacceptable and cannot continue, which I did do. And leaders need a confessor confidant from outside the congregation, because you will find, as I found, that all of your efforts to use traditional strategies aren't working, and you'll need to be able to check in with somebody about what might work. Ultimately, I involved not only a PhD psychologist, but the university attorney to help us to know how to respond to an individual who was making insatiable demands, because I needed that counsel. So a lot of the things that we say about managing conflict and even managing difficult personalities aren't terribly effective with true antagonists, and even conventional therapy is not particularly effective with true antagonists. So sometimes we need to figure out how do we help this person move out of our system, which was ultimately the decision that I made. So bullying. Bullying behavior is what this is. And so my summary would be, all of us are capable of bullying behavior, particularly in high-intensity conflict. But when we're called on it, most of us will stop it. Most of us realize, yeah, you're right, I just lost control for a moment there, or I've been so passionate about this issue that I spoke out of turn. Or, you're right, I need to go directly to the person, I need to talk to Don directly and not about him. That's how I recognize when it's somebody in high-intensity conflict or somebody who truly has a pattern of antagonism, because they will continue the bullying behavior, absolutely convinced that they're doing the right thing. Whereas most of us will not when we're called on it. Okay, want to give Houck suggestions for responding to antagonists. This is his list, and I think there's some good insight here. Realize antagonists are never happy, and you cannot make them happy. Never do this alone. This is where Lone Rangers always fail. Even though Houck has a chapter on meeting one-on-one with antagonists, I actually don't think it's a very good idea. I chose to involve the executive director of our department in meeting with the individual that I needed to meet with, because I didn't want to. And I also said to him, and I'll make up a name, Bruce, you're welcome to invite somebody to be in this meeting as well, but I want to have somebody with me. Cement your calling and refine the next steps in your ministry. He's basically saying, have a backup plan in case you do need to leave if this doesn't work out. And I like this. I found myself getting hooked by Bruce, this student whose name I'm making up. And when he would come into the building, I could just feel the hackles rising. And as I was talking with my wife about it, she said, quote, I don't think your attitude is very good either, David. So it was true. I was loaded for bear and had to acknowledge that my own spirit had been turned by it. And those of you who have dealt with this would understand. So final thoughts from Houck. Know when to leave and when to stay. The casualty rate for pastors who have dealt with true antagonists is very high. And I think we picked up some of that in your earlier comments. It can crush your spirit, diminish your sense of personhood and self-worth, and even threaten your attachment to the church. But this I really like, this second observation, imperative to recognize that the behavior of this antagonist is a congregational problem, even though it's going to be hard to remind yourself of that because it's so focused on you. That's what antagonists do. They will focus entirely on you and why you are the problem. And we have to remind ourselves that actually their behavior is the problem, but it's a problem that we all have to figure out how to deal with, particularly the leadership of the congregation, the leadership as a team. So here are some concerns that I have, and this is why I'm not a Houck fundamentalist, even though I know some who are. The danger of amateur diagnosis, which I wanted Susan to speak with, because even those who know the DSM-5 model backwards and forwards can struggle to really get personality disorders diagnosed correctly, let alone those of us who are amateurs. And so if we go around assuming that this person is a narcissist because they were talking about themselves in our last meeting, we might get it wrong. Anyhow, I also hesitate to see evil, particularly evil intent, in people who I think are deeply wounded. So a genuine narcissist has a narcissistic wound, usually from childhood. And when I was able to begin to see that in Bruce, the student that I dealt with, and actually got some insight into his family of origin, I thought, oh, this is starting to make a little bit of sense why someone would behave that way. I'm not going to justify the behavior, but I can understand the woundedness. And that was the first time that I had a little bit of compassion for what I experienced as deeply harmful behavior. It also assumes that leaders are always the victims of antagonism. And just to be honest with you, I've also dealt with 3 ethical misconduct cases, 2 of them sexual misconduct, by pastors. So I know that leaders are not always just victims. Leaders can be perpetrators. I can be a perpetrator as well as a victim. So I think we have to be careful not to assume that we are always in the right simply because we're in a leadership role. We also mess up. So that's what I would put alongside of Houck's excellent book, Some Cautions. I want to get your comments.
I was just curious, talked about narcissists often having deep wounds.
Yes.
Are we talking about, and I'm assuming it's all of these, sexual, spiritual, physical, emotional, personal, all of the above?
Any of those.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but I think those childhood wounds can be particularly profound. So where we're going to go in the discussion for the rest of the day, yeah. Hey, Don, can I take you up on your earlier offer to run the mic? Is basically how to build up a healthy immune system, but let's unpack this a little bit more.
When you mentioned that on woundedness, what's helped me throughout the years, whether it's me or someone else, to reflect on hurt people, and healed people, heal people.
Oh, what's the second part?
Healed people, heal people.
Nice.
So not just stop with a hurt, but remember the second part as well.
Yeah. So our STAR program, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, is really big on hurt people, but I like your addition. Healed people, heal people.
It was given to me. I didn't
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Other comments on Houck's model? Yes.
If you are trying to solve a problem with an antagonist, true antagonist, I understand wounded versus evil.
Yeah.
But if you have a plan, should it change your plan? I understand you may have compassion, but should it change your plan of dealing with the situation?
Yes, my strategy was first to involve a PhD psychologist, have someone who could do an accurate diagnosis, and try to get this particular student in treatment. That plan was a complete failure because the student figured out that that's what we were trying to do and sabotaged it. And so plan B was to involve an attorney to find out what was necessary to get this person out of our system because of the damage that was being done to other students and to faculty and staff. I prayed literally every night that plan A would succeed because my goal was healing and treatment, but when it did not, I felt we had to go to plan B. Any other questions or comments on Houck's model before we ask you to talk about it at your tables? Particularly, we're going to ask you to talk about what you agree with and disagree with. Yes.
I think it's very interesting to note Plan B in the scenario just gave. Most of the time within the system, we need to believe the systems are designed to self-perpetuate themselves.
Yes, they are.
Based upon that, we should not, when you had the screen up about your next step, submitting your call, I think there are sometimes we should not rely upon the system to come rescue us. The system may resource and may be compassionate, but will do things that's going to enhance itself. And I think that's very important. That will lower our anxiety, knowing going in that the system, whether it's a local church or a small organization or the larger church or larger organization, and at the end of the day, it's going to do all it can to take care of itself. And that'll be very helpful to an individual going through a crisis. It's a lot easier to get rid of a coach or a manager than to get rid of a team.
Yes, your point's well taken. Every organization has a life of its own, and it will work for its own self-perpetuation, not necessarily for the protection of the leader of that system. Yeah.
What if the antagonist leaves your church and goes to another church? Do you tell that church? Do you warn the church? Do you let the higher-ups or the leadership forewarn that church? What do you do in that situation?
Well, since I work in a university rather than a church system, I'm wondering if Don would respond to that question, because I think that's an important question.
Sorry, Don.
Are you willing? To what degree do you inform future possible victims, is the question.
I believe that it is not helpful to kind of call in advance and say, get ready, folks, this is going to be a bad thing. I think there's a certain level of giving a benefit of the doubt in this new situation. But if in fact this person really is an antagonist, it's going to happen whether we warn them or not. And we can expect to be getting phone calls from them to say, did this happen when you were dealing with this person? That's kind of my take on it. I really don't think it's appropriate to kind of go talking in advance.
Yeah, but my hunch is you'll hear from that pastor within about a year, or the DS will hear, saying, I've got an issue with so-and-so. And at that point, you could decide how much information to disclose.
I think it's important at that point, if you're in a situation where a staff member or somebody is going to another place and they ask for a reference, I think that's a different deal. But yes. I think it's because I've had situations where had problems with a staff member, and the next thing I knew they were hired by somebody else, and they never checked to find out what it was before.
Yeah, I could actually think of several situations where associate ministers seem to function in antagonistic ways in multiple settings. So,
but I think by the same token, we all know times and places where it wasn't a good fit and they just didn't seem to do well, and they went into a different situation. Yes. And it's like, wow, they're doing great. So I think it's kind of like I said, for the quote I read from Walter Brueggemann, we are a people of hope. Mm-hmm. And I think that should be on the front end of what we do.
Amen. Grace and forgiveness should be our first and most important strategy.
I think we need to be careful too. I know that there are, I'm not sure if it's state or federal regulations, when you're asked for information on a former employee, there are only certain things you can say and certain things you cannot say. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about a staff member of the church, that falls under that jurisdiction.
Personnel issues you're talking about? Yeah.
I just have a question I'd like you to comment, if you will, in church conflict from contention to collaboration. I remember reading a year ago this book and journaling about this one line in the book that said, in almost every church there's a bully, and then it said, the congregations both need and feed the bully. Need the bully because if there's any little thing going on that they don't like, they can pass on to Brother John, knowing that Brother John will take it up and run with it.
Right.
And therefore, they feed the bully. And I remember journaling about that, and I just wanted your thoughts.
Well, one of the first congregational cases I worked with was a little brethren congregation in western Pennsylvania, and they wanted me to come, and I was in my late 20s. I was so new to this, but my boss couldn't go, so he sent me, and they said, we want you to observe a congregational meeting and then tell us what we should do about it. So at this congregational meeting, they presented a proposal. In fact, it was for a consulting process. And this older gentleman, who was probably in his 80s, stood up in the back of the room and just slammed the proposal, all that was wrong with it, and why would anybody waste all this money on consulting, and what's wrong with our leaders, and sat down. And afterwards they said, that's him. That's our church bully. He fights everything. Well, 6 months later, he died. And I was still working with him, and they all went, oh, thank God. I mean, not literally said that, but you could just kind of feel it. Now things will be fine. At their next congregational meeting, a young woman in her 20s stood up and shot down a proposal. Because even though the man had died, the role was needed in the system. The congregation needed somebody who could raise critical questions. And they were all shocked. But I had been reading Generation to Generation by Friedman about role replacement theory, and I said, you just saw an example of role replacement theory, is that when the critic died, somebody had to take his place. So the real question is, how do we handle difference and disagreement, and can we come up with a better model than standing up in the back of the room and shooting down every proposal? i.e., can we invite people in earlier to express their disagreements? So what we really need to do is change our conflict habits. It's almost never about getting rid of the bad people, unless it's a true antagonist. It is about changing our bad habits. That's very important. So what I'd like you to do for the next 20, 30 minutes is to talk around your tables. To what degree do you think Houck's model is helpful? To what degree do you think it might be harmful? How do we recognize the difference between true antagonists, again, he's using it as a noun, and good people like you and me in this room who are using unhelpful behaviors because we're in a high-level conflict and don't know what else to do? So, is Houck's model helpful? How do we distinguish between true antagonists and simply conflict-frustrated people? And have that conversation for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to check in with you at 2:30.
I was going to tell you that there's a book called Personal Theory of